Logic Pro. I have recorded the Fender Jazzmaster straight in to the DAW through my Universal Audio Apollo device. I did not use any effects, just straight in, direct, so it'll sound pretty dry. Now, one thing I'll mention at the beginning is Brian actually really liked the sound of direct guitars and would plug his guitars in direct more often than using an amp. I think this is so, like, a great example of that. It's the beginning of Christmas. Well, all of Christmas Day is direct guitar. Very distinct sound. There's no amp coloration to it at all. Straight into the console. And then When I Grow Up to Be a Man, just straight in, direct. So, in some ways, just simply plugging your guitar straight in and doing nothing to it can be a very Beach Boysy sound on its own. But I recognize that's not what most people are talking about when they're talking about a Beach Boys guitar sound. So, let's start at the beginning, and this goes for everything that I do in trying to recreate what things sounded like. You have to picture the instrument in space, in context, and follow what is making the sound all the way through every connection, microphone, processor, every medium that sound is transferred to. And we have to deal with that using different solutions in your DAW. So if we think about an early Beach Boys track, say Surfin' USA, we've got a person, Carl Wilson, playing his guitar, his Fender guitar, through a Fender amp. And that's the first stage of the signal. So let's start by finding a good amp. And you can do this with almost any good amp emulation. I like to use Amplitude 5. We're going to do a mono signal, not mono to stereo. Mono because it would have been a mono input into the board. And so the Beach Boys pretty equipment in the studio. So I'm assuming that at this point they were using their onstage dual showman, Fender dual showman. But it's possible they used their bass amp or their Fender Bassman as well. But what I've kind of settled in on using the dual showman model in Amplitude 5 here, which is under the Jimi Hendrix collection, which is an extra add-on. You can see here American Vintage D. The D stands for dual showman. It's a silver face Fender amp, which the Beach Boys dual showmans were not. They would have been blonde, I think, which is probably somewhere between brown face and black face electronics inside. So what I like to do to offset the silver face electronics is choose like a tweed cab. So let's go to the Fender cab collection and use just like a 2x12, probably be good here. So what we're doing is using the cabinet of a 57 Fender amp and the amplifier section of the Showman, and I think that's kind of a good compromise since they don't have a model of an earlier Showman. You just kind of have to do what you can. Again, the most important thing here is that you're using a good Fender simulation plugin, and you can find good Fender amp plugins in Amplitube. Universal Audio makes a good one. There's others out there, and even in Logic Pro's onboard amps, you can find a good one, and I'm going to show you that later. So let's go back to the cab and just kind of talk about how we're going to capture the sound of the amp. So most of the time we're recording in Western 3, and so we're in a room. Microphones on guitar amps were almost always Shure 545s at Western. Electro Voice 666s at Gold Star, and probably 545s at Sunset Sound. So in a program like this where you can choose what mic to put on the amp, I would either go with the sort of more modern equivalent of those, so either a Shure 57 in place of the 545, or an Electro Voice RE20 in place of the 666. Let's just do the 57. I like to pull it back from the grill a little bit if you have that option in your amp sim, but pretty much at the center. Now, we're not going to be using this second mic, so let's mute that. We're not going to be using the built-in room sound because we're going to be tweaking that in another program. And we're not using a DI, so that's muted. So all we have is the amp being picked up by a single microphone. Everything matches that first stage of capturing the sound in the studio in the early 60s. So now we need to get a sound on the amp. So let's just play this. Now, that's not bad. You just kind of have to dial it in with your own ears. Start by turning the reverb off. Obviously, you want a lot of treble on there, because Murray Wilson. Fair amount of presence. Bass and mids around halfway. Let's see what that sounds like. I'll turn the output down a little bit here so I can turn up the volume on the amp a little bit more. It doesn't really break up, so you don't want to drive it too hard. So I think that's a pretty good sound. It might be pushed a little too hard, so I'm going to turn the gain down to like 4. Okay, so we've got that. Now, the question is reverb on the amp. And while by and large they did not use amp reverb a lot, because that leaves it up to the guitarist, and producers like to control things from the booth. However, the Beach Boys in the early days and over the course of their career certainly used amp reverb. And I'm sure they used amp reverb on this kind of 63 stuff. So let's use the amp reverb here and just dial it in as we listen. So that's too much. It's probably still a little bit too much. A little bit goes a long way with guitar reverb. Alright, so I would call that a pretty good basic sound to start with. So now we've got that, let me show you using Logic's amps. Do a mono amp designer, and let's do a small brown panel combo. And let's mic that with, let's do a Electro Voice RE20s, subbing in for like a EV666. Let's see how that sounds. It's a pretty nice sound. That's a little cutting. Drop the output a little. Oh, the master's too hot. Let's turn that down. And here we can use amp reverb too. I think that's pretty good. Alright, so moving forward from here, we have captured the amp sound through microphone. Let's go back to the Amplitube. So this is now the Amplitube 5 dual Showman deal here. Alright, so now we have to think about the other components of this recording. Now, as I said before, these guitars are going to be recorded in a room if they're not going direct, if they're being microphoned, if it's a mic'd up amplifier, it's in a room. So what we want to do is simulate a room, and there's many ways to do that. What I do is set up a send to an effect on bus 1 here, and I'm going to use Universal Audio's Ocean Way room emulation, which is there. Now, this we are going to do in stereo because sometimes things were going to more than one channel and thus able to be played back in stereo. So, United, or at the time, I think it's called United again, but it was Ocean Way when they did this emulation. So United B, or Ocean Way Room B, it's a little bigger than Western 3. It's what, 35 by 45, and Western was like 33 by 15. But it's similar room in spirit. So let's do guitar cab And let's add... Oh, no, we don't want it inside there. No. So, you know, supposedly you can move around where the source is coming from in the room. Let's do something like that and see how that sounds. So, I'm not going to teach you how to use this plugin, but basically you can set up these different mics at different distances in United Recorders B, and it will sound like you were in that room when you were recording. So this is a very subtle effect. And you want to do reverb, because we do want the direct sound. Everything that this is, you know, this represents, say, Brian's bass mic, Dennis's drum mic, picking up the sound of Carl's amp. So it's not a direct sound. And so let's put a little juice into that send and see how it sounds. So there it is so low, and you can just pretend that this is everybody's mic's up except Carl's. And then let's just kind of... That sounds pretty good. So again, we're keeping this very subtle. It's just leaking, so it's not something we're going to mix in a lot of. But there it is. It's a little break-uppy still for me. Turn the gain down a little, turn the volume down a little. That should be fine. Okay, so we've got kind of everything that's in the room now. So now we have to start thinking about the electronics. So in those days, that microphone would have been fed into something like a 12 input tube console. So what we can do is put that in the chain. I will use the same preamp that they used at Western 3, which is the Universal Audio 610A. And again, mono. And that brings up this, which is the exact preamp that they were using at Western 3 throughout the 60s. So let's just see how this sounds. And we're not using this to really audibly affect anything. It's just there to be in the signal chain. It's possible they added some high end at the board. You can experiment with that. It's nice and crisp. So it doesn't have to be the Universal Audio 610. There's lots of other good tube console emulations out there. I like Soundtoys Decapitator or Radiator. If you want to go a little more modern, there's Plugin Alliance makes a lot of nice console things. Waves obviously has tons. You can use the Abbey Road desk. So just look around for tube console emulation. And we're going to use a lot of this, so it's important that you have a good one. But again, we're not using it as something to really markedly change the sound. It's there to be a very, very subtle addition to the chain. All right, so the 12 input boards at these studios were generally routed down 3 output buses because they were doing recording on 3-track tape. So you can pick to send any of the 12 signals that come into the board out through any of 3 outputs, left, center, or right. And I like to think of each stage of this as another preamp, even though it's not quite that way in reality, but let's think of it as that. So if I want to send Carl's guitar, if I'm recording Carl's guitar and I want to send it out down the center bus, that's another preamp. So I add another preamp. And this represents the electronics in the center bus. Again, we want real transparent. So, don't use the EQ on this one. This is just to put it through the electronics. Yeah. So that's what we're going to do there. Now, it's possible that you would send, even if the guitar had amp reverb on, it's possible that you'd want just a little more reverb on there. So, let's set up another reverb send to experiment with. It's going to be bus 2, and we are going to use, let's do, I like IK Multimedia's Sunset Sound Studio Reverb pretty well. You can do mono or stereo. They would have used a mono send and return, obviously, but you can kind of think of when they were using different tracks, they would use different reverb sources for each bus, potentially. So in a way, you can kind of expand it with stereo. I'm going to do mono because that's the sort of pure way to do it. There's a lot of reverb plugins out there. None of them are perfect. So you just kind of have to know what you're after and live with the compromises you're making. So I usually turn off pre-delay. It's totally wet, no dry signal at all, so you can solo that. Set it to mono. Usually we'll do some filtering of stuff under 150K or so, and above like 12 or 150 hertz, that is, and above like 12K hertz there. Just a little bit off of both of those. Let's see what that sounds like. So if we mix that in with the amp reverb, You just have to find a balance where it's not too crazy. That's obviously too much, right? So that's good. Just a very subtle chamber effect there. So I think that's pretty good. When I use the Sunset Sound plugin, Studio 1 usually works pretty well. Studio 3 is also really nice for some things. You just have to try it. Now, alternatively, instead of using the United B plugin, I could have used the Sunset Sound room, where it's modeled after that room. I find that it doesn't sound quite as good as the Ocean Way one. It's a little more obviously that distinct sound of sampled room, where it's obviously they're playing something through a speaker, and anyway, but the chambers are pretty good. Universal Audio's Capital Chambers is really good, and I highly recommend anybody with Universal Audio products to use that, because that's probably the most natural sounding chamber, but sometimes you don't need it to be that good. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, so if I were doing this for a real project, I might put electronics in the reverb signal chain, because again, the send to the reverb and the return would both have to be powered by some sort of amplifier. I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference, but sometimes I do that just because I'm unhinged. So if I was going to do that, I'd put, like a preamp before the reverb chamber and a preamp after the reverb chamber. And, it's just kind of ridiculous. Not sure if that sounds... Anyway, that is, that's over the top. But I do like to do that, because I'm over the top. Alright. So, we've captured the sound of the guitar, we've sent it through some electronics on the board, and now it's going to be hitting a tape machine. So, you can put this in different spots in the signal chain. Let's put it in line on the channel with the guitar. And again, any reputable tape emulation is fine. Let's do... See, when you have too many plugins, it just gets harder to choose. And you just have to work on them so much to know what you're getting. Let's do the Waves J37. So, now we are hitting emulated tape. 15 IPS is what they recorded tracks at a lot of the time. Play around with formula, see what you like. And that's really all you need to do. You can experiment with saturation, but that goes a long way real quickly. Let's listen to something else. What did I do doing? I did some fake in my room stuff. Oh, here we go. Fake Surfer Girl. So, don't use too much saturation if you have that option. Don't add noise. So if you want to hit the tape harder, you can mess with that. That can sometimes sound good depending on the plugin. Oh, there we go. There's some in my room kind of stuff. Alright, so we've got it hitting tape. Now, after we've got everything on tape, we've got Carl's guitar here on tape, we've got other stuff on other tracks, then we have to mix the song down. So now it's coming off the tape, back through the board. So we have to add another preamp. And here's a little insider tip for you. When Mark Lynette told me many years ago that when they brought line level in through the board, it was padded down. So I always put the pad on. If I can get it to work, you silly thing. Well, I guess that's not going to work. Anyway, so we've got another layer of electronics in here. Yeah. So again, not looking to do a whole lot with the sound other than put it through this extra layer of electronics. Everything's neutral here. We're not pushing the level very hard. So then after we have captured the tape being fed back through the board to be dubbed down to mono, we've gone through the board and now it has to hit tape again. So here in the master stereo out, let's pick, let's do Universal Audio's. Let's do the Ampex. And there we are. If you are used to doing more modern music, you might say, what about compressors or other processing, EQ? Fact is, they really didn't use those. Western, every individual studio in Western, you usually see a single Universal Audio 176 compressor sitting on a desk that they could patch into. I get the sense that they just use that to control vocals. And if they did use compression beyond that, it's possible they compressed to tape. In other words, they would put compressors on one of the outputs to tape. I haven't found evidence that that's something they did, but they could. And everything was so patchable that it would not be hard if for some reason you wanted to use 3 compressors on each bus. So all 3 signals to the 3-track were compressed. They could do that. I just don't think they did until much later in the 60s. So there's not going to be any compression or EQ or anything before we hit the master tape here. So let's see how this sounds. Do 15 IPS. Use 1/4" tape. That's that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Now, there is still the matter of mastering, and I'm not as knowledgeable about mastering practices, but it would probably involve some kind of basic EQ curve and maybe a little limiting. So so that would be put on when they're, pressing to disk. I'm thinking the lathes, where the lathe that's connected to the tape output would probably have some kind of EQ curve and possibly a limiter. So let's do the Logic tube. So this is sort of the Pultec emulation, and I'm just going to do I'm just going to pick a preset to kind of let's try Master Shine. Drive it too much. I think that's fine. That's the kind of thing you could fiddle with for a really long time. Okay, and then let's pretend there's a limiter in place in between the tape output and the lathe. And let's just do Universal Audio. Oh no, let's do an LA 2A. And we're just going to limit. Medium compression. Don't need it to be hitting that hard. You should barely see the needle moving. Something like that's probably about right. Just a little movement of the needle. Alright, so that is how I get a Beach Boys guitar sound. It's just the way I do it. And, I haven't been doing any A-B comparison here to check my work. But off the top of my head, I'm happy with this. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. I'm happy to share. I'd be happy to do another video like this where I talk about using an actual amp if you have access to a real amp. This is all in the box, but there's other ways to do it. Please do let me know if you have any questions, because I really enjoy talking about this stuff. And if you think I could do anything better, let me know that too. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I will be back real soon with more Beach Boys production stuff. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.